The night Rose Sutton learned she had been traded like a horse at auction. She was standing in her father's kitchen with flour on her hands and a hymn on her lips, completely unaware that her future had already been decided by a losing hand of cards. It was the spring of 1878 in the dry, sun-scorched territory of New Mexico, where the town of Cimarron sat like a dusty jewel at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Cimarron was the kind of place that asked no questions and kept no secrets, which was a contradiction so ordinary that nobody bothered to remark on it anymore. The streets were packed clay, the saloons were loud, and the men who passed through were often the kind who had left something behind them, a name, a warrant, a woman, and were not in any particular hurry to look back. Rose had grown up in this town the way a wildflower grows in hostile soil, stubbornly, beautifully, and entirely without permission. She was 22 years old. With dark auburn hair she wore pinned up in a way that never quite held past noon, and green eyes so clear and direct that strangers found it difficult to lie to her, though many tried. She worked her father's dry goods store 6 days a week, kept his accounts, baked his bread, and had quietly given up on the idea that anyone in Cimarron was worth marrying. She had standards that the town struggled to meet, and she did not apologize for them. Her father, Hank Sutton, was a different creature altogether. He was a man who had once been prosperous, once been kind, and once been the sort of husband and father a family could rely upon. The years had worn those qualities down the way water wears down stone, slowly and without drama, until what remained was something still recognizable but fundamentally altered. Hank Sutton drank. He gambled. He borrowed money he could not repay and made promises he could not keep, and he did all of this with a cheerfulness that Rose had long since stopped finding charming. On the night that changed everything, Hank Sutton sat across a felt-covered table at the Silver Moon Saloon from a man named Louis Brenner, and proceeded to lose everything he had brought to the game, and then, when that was gone, everything he could think of to put in its place. Louis Brenner was 30 years old, and he had the kind of face that looked as though it had been carved by someone with strong opinions. His jaw was square, his nose had been broken once and set imperfectly, and his eyes were the color of dark amber, steady and quiet in a way that made people either trust him immediately or distrust him for the same reason. He had come to Cimarron 3 months earlier with a small cattle operation, and a reputation for honest dealing that he had built slowly and deliberately over a decade of working other men's land before finally acquiring his own. He dressed simply, spoke plainly, and had no patience for pretense, which made him an unusual man in a territory where pretense was practically a currency. He had not sat down at Hank Sutton's table to win anything in particular. He had come to the Silver Moon for a quiet drink, and had been drawn into the game by the particular boredom of a Tuesday evening. He played well because he always played carefully, and within 2 hours Hank Sutton owed him $240, which was a sum that Hank Sutton absolutely did not have. The table had gone quiet in that particular way it does when a man's ruin becomes apparent to everyone around him. Hank Sutton was sweating, his collar damp, his cards face down on the table in the gesture of a man surrendering. The other 2 players had folded and leaned back in their chairs with the expressions of men watching a storm from a covered porch, interested but uninvested. "Mr. Brenner," Hank said, and his voice had that specific quality of a man trying to sound casual while sliding over a cliff. "I am, as you can see, temporarily short of liquid capital." "I can see that," Louis said. He was not unkind about it. He simply set his cards down and waited. "My deed is tied up in a legal matter at present," Hank said, which was not entirely untrue. The deed was tied up in the fact that he had already borrowed against it twice. "But I have another kind of asset." Louis looked at him with the expression of a man who has learned to be careful when people use the word asset with that particular inflection. "My daughter," Hank said. "Rose. She's 22, healthy, capable. She can run a household better than any woman in this county. A man with land needs a wife, Mr. Brenner, I'm offering her hand in settlement." The saloon had gone very quiet. Someone at the bar coughed. The piano, which had been playing something approximating a waltz in the back corner, stumbled to a stop. Louis Brenner looked at Hank Sutton for a long moment, and what moved across his face in that moment was not greed, not triumph, and not the casual acceptance of a man who thought this was a normal transaction. It was something more complicated, a flash of outrage, quickly controlled, followed by a deeper, more careful consideration. He should have refused. He knew it even as the idea settled into the space of that quiet moment. He should have pushed back from the table and told Hank Sutton that a man's daughter was not a gambling chip, and walked out of the silver moon into the cool New Mexico night. That is what a straightforward man would have done. But Louis Brenner had been watching Hank Sutton for 3 months, as men do in a small town where everyone's business eventually becomes everyone else's conversation. He had watched the way Rose Sutton's name came up when her father's debts were discussed, the way other men nodded knowingly, the way the word available had been used once by a man named Garrett Cole in a way that made Louis's jaw tight. Garrett Cole was a rancher of some wealth and considerable nastiness, and he had made no secret of his interest in the Sutton girl, nor of his belief that her father's financial difficulties would eventually deliver her into a situation where she had little choice. Louis thought about that. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took Hank Sutton to refill his glass with shaking hands. "All right," Louis said quietly. "Debt settled." He said it not because he wanted to own a woman, not because he thought for a moment that this arrangement was right or proper, but because something in him recognized that if he did not take this place at the table, someone else would, and that someone else might be Garrett Cole. He went home that night and did not sleep, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether he had done the right thing. Rose spent the next morning doing what she always did, opening the store at 7, sweeping the boards, checking the inventory her father had been supposed to check and had not. She was tallying a column of figures when the bell above the door announced a customer, and she looked up expecting old Mrs. Carraway wanting sugar, and found Louis Brenner standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had never seen on a man before, something that looked very much like a man preparing to confess something. She had seen Louis Brenner around town, of course. Cimarron was not large enough to miss anyone for long. She knew he had the Brenner cattle operation out east of town, knew he was considered a fair dealer and an honest man, knew he had dark amber eyes that she had noticed precisely once and then firmly decided not to notice again. He was the sort of man you noticed, and then had to make a deliberate effort not to keep noticing, which was its own kind of trouble. "Miss Sutton," he said. "Mr. Brenner." She set down her pen with the care of a woman who suspected she might need her hands free. "Can I help you with something?" He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with the careful deliberation of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and has decided the rehearsal was inadequate. He turned his hat in his hands twice, and then set it on the counter with the air of a man putting down a burden. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need to tell you the truth of it, all of it, even though there is no version of this conversation that is easy." Rose looked at him steadily. "I generally prefer the truth, even when it is difficult." He met her eyes, and what she saw there was not the look of a man with bad intentions. It was the look of a man trying very hard to do the right thing by something he had perhaps already gotten wrong. "Your father and I played cards last night," he said, "at the Silver Moon." Something went cold in Rose's chest, but she did not look away. "He gambles," she said. Her voice was level. It was the voice of a woman who had learned long ago to keep her face composed even when the ground was moving under her. "He lost considerably," Louis said. $240. He had no money to settle the debt. He paused, and she could see him deciding to move through it rather than around it, which she later thought was the first thing she truly respected about him. "He offered your hand in settlement. I accepted." The silence that followed was not the silence of a woman struck dumb. It was the silence of a woman doing rapid and furious calculations. Rose did not cry. She did not reach for the counter for support. She pressed her lips together very tightly, and for 5 full seconds she was absolutely still, and then she said, "He did what?" It was not a question. It was the sentence of a woman whose composure was doing extraordinary work. "He offered your hand in marriage," Louis said, "as settlement of his gambling debt, and I accepted." He held her gaze. "And then I spent the night thinking about the fact that you had not been told, and that it was not right for you to learn it any way other than directly from me." Rose turned away from him. She walked to the window at the back of the counter and looked out at the alley behind the store, at the dirt and the boards and the ordinary, unremarkable world that had been her life. She was quiet for long enough that Louis, behind her, did not know whether to speak or wait. She turned back. Her eyes were very bright, but not with tears, with something that burned cleaner and hotter than tears. "You came here," she said carefully, "to tell me yourself." "Yes. You did not have to do that." "No," he said. "I did not." She looked at him for a moment. "Why did you accept?" It was the question he had known was coming, and he answered it honestly because he had decided on honesty as his only strategy, his only possible redemption in this situation. He told her about Garrett Cole. He told her what he had heard, what he had seen, what he had considered in those quiet seconds across the card table while Hank Sutton waited with his shaking hands. Rose listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "So you believe you protected me?" "I don't know if protected is the right word," he said. "I thought I was choosing the lesser harm. I may have been wrong. I was certainly presumptuous. And I am standing here now because I think you deserve to know the truth and to make your own decision about what comes next." She absorbed that. She looked at him with those clear green eyes that made lying difficult, and she said, "What do you want, Mr. Brenner? Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to do right by you. I don't know yet what right looks like in this particular situation. But I want you to have a choice in it." Rose nodded slowly. "Go home, Mr. Brenner, let me think." He picked up his hat. He put it on. He was almost at the door when she spoke again. "Thank you," she said, "for coming here and telling me yourself." He did not say "you're welcome" because it did not seem like the right response. He nodded once and he left. Rose went directly to her father. She found him in the back room of the house behind the store, still in the clothes he had worn the night before, which told her something. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, this man who had once carried her on his shoulders to see the stars, who had taught her to read by the light of an oil lamp, who had become, somewhere in the years since her mother died, a man she recognized but could no longer reach. "Did you do it?" she asked. Hank Sutton looked up. He had the grace to look ashamed, which was something, though it was not enough. "Rose," he began, "did you offer my hand to Louis Brenner in settlement of a gambling debt?" she said, "without asking me, without telling me, as if I were a piece of property and not a person." He looked at his hands. "I didn't have any other way to settle it. You could have refused to play. Rose, you could have walked away from the table. It doesn't always work like that." "It always works exactly like that," she said. "You just didn't want it to." She was trembling, she realized, not with fear but with something that had been building for years, accumulating in the way that debt accumulates, quietly and inevitably. "Papa, you sold me." The word hung in the air between them. Hank Sutton could not look at her. "He seems like a decent man," her father said weakly. "That is not the point," Rose said. "That has never been the point." She turned away from him, because looking at him any longer was going to make her say things she could not take back, and she was not sure she wanted to take them back, which frightened her. She spent the rest of the day working. She served customers, counted inventory, wrote figures in the ledger with a precision that was its own kind of fury translated into something useful. By the time she closed the store and walked out into the long copper evening, she had decided 3 things. The first was that she was not going to be determined by what her father had done. The second was that she was not going to refuse Louis Brenner's arrangement out of pride alone, if the alternative was what Louis had described Garrett Cole's interest, was something she had noticed herself. And it was the interest of a man who had never in his life considered that a woman might have preferences of her own. The third thing she decided was that if she was going to enter into any kind of arrangement with Louis Brenner, she was going to enter it on her own terms with her eyes fully open, and she was going to know exactly what kind of man he was before she agreed to anything. She had 2 weeks of her own before anything became official. That was how long these things took. The posting of intentions at the county seat, the minimum notice. 2 weeks was enough to learn something real about a person, if you paid attention. She paid attention. She began stopping by the Brenner place on her way back from the store, ostensibly to discuss the terms of whatever arrangement they were going to come to, actually to watch him. She watched how he treated his horses. She watched how he spoke to the 2 ranch hands who worked for him, a young man named Paco Reyes and an older man named Chester who had been working cattle longer than Louis had been alive. She watched him fix a fence post one afternoon with the quiet competence of a man who is not performing his competence for anyone, who simply does what needs doing because it needs doing. She asked him questions. Some of the questions were practical, about the ranch, about his finances, about what exactly he expected from a wife. Some of the questions were less practical and more personal, and she asked them because she was not interested in pretending with him. "Do you think a woman is capable of managing a business?" She asked him one evening when she had accepted a cup of coffee on his porch, and they were watching the sky go from orange to violet over the mountain line. He considered the question. "I think you manage your father's business and have done for at least 2 years, he said, "which is a more useful observation than my general opinion." "That is a careful answer," she said. "It is an honest one." She looked at him sideways. "Do you want a wife you can talk to or a wife who stays quiet and keeps house?" "I would rather have a wife who talks," he said. "A quiet house is just a building." She thought about that for a long moment, and then she said, "I'll make a bargain with you, Mr. Brenner." "All right. I will not refuse this arrangement, but I will not enter it as a debt paid. If this is to be a marriage, then it will be a marriage between 2 people who have chosen it, and I need you to court me properly. Not for show. Actually properly, as though we are 2 people who are deciding whether to spend their lives together, because that is what we are." Louis looked at her. The amber of his eyes had the warm depth of lamplight in the dusk. "That seems fair," he said. "More than fair." "Then we're agreed." "We are," he said. He extended his hand. She shook it, and the contact was brief and firm, and when she walked home that evening Rose Sutton found that she was breathing a little differently than she had been in some time, not easier exactly, but more deliberately, like a woman who has opened a door and is choosing to walk through it. The courtship that followed was the most unusual in Cimarron's recent memory, which was a town that prided itself on its opinion of other people's business. They were seen together regularly, which was expected given the arrangement that was circulating in the towns, gossip the way all gossip circulates, everywhere at once and slightly distorted. What was not expected was the quality of those appearances. Louis Brenner did not bring Rose flowers and stand awkwardly on her porch making strained conversation. He brought her, on one occasion, a copy of a novel she had mentioned wanting to read. He had ordered it from Santa Fe, which meant he had ordered it before she mentioned it, which meant he had been paying attention to her long before the card game. He drove her out to see the canyon east of town one Sunday afternoon because she had said once, in passing, that she had never been, and he had remembered. He did not talk constantly. He was comfortable with silence in a way that Rose, who was surrounded by noise and demand, and the constant social performance of running a store, found deeply restful. She told him about her mother one evening, about how Eleanor Sutton had been the kind of woman who could quiet a room just by entering it, not with beauty or drama, but with a kind of steady, warm competence that made everyone around her feel safer. Rose had been 17 when Eleanor died of fever, and the 3 years before her father's decline into gambling had been the 3 hardest years of her life, when she was old enough to understand exactly what had been lost but not yet old enough to carry it without weight. Louis listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it or diminish it or redirect it toward something more comfortable. He just listened, and when she was done he said, "She sounds like someone you carry with you." "I try to," Rose said. "I can see her in you," he said. "The steadiness." Rose looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in the carefully maintained distance between them, not collapsed but softened. "Your turn," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 boys in a family that had farmed land that was not quite good enough to farm, and kept trying anyway with the particular stubbornness of people who do not know how to stop. He told her about coming west at 18 with $15 and a horse, and an absolute absence of any clear plan. He told her about the years of working other men's cattle, the dirt and the cold, and the particular loneliness of seasons that belonged to someone else's land. He told her about the moment, 7 years ago in Colorado, when he had looked at a spread of land and thought, this is what I want, and then had spent the following 7 years doing the work of getting there. "And now you're here," Rose said. "And now I'm here," he agreed. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and what she saw was not the man who had accepted a woman as a gambling debt settlement, not the arrangement, not the uncomfortable transaction that had started all of this. She saw a man who had built something real out of nothing much, who had treated her since the first moment of that terrible conversation with more honesty and more respect than most people had in a lifetime, who was quiet where other men were loud and thoughtful where other men were hasty. She was not yet in love with him. She was honest enough with herself to know the difference, but she was something. She was interested, genuinely and increasingly, in a way that had nothing to do with the arrangement and everything to do with him. The trouble arrived, as trouble in Cimarron tended to, in the form of Garrett Cole. Garrett Cole was 41 years old, heavyset, with the kind of confidence that money and lack of consequence provides over a long period of time. He had a ranch 3 times the size of Louis', a reputation for getting what he wanted by whatever combination of pressure and persuasion was required, and an interest in Rose Sutton that predated Louis Brenner's arrival in the territory by about a year. He had not, in that year, actually done anything about his interest. He was the sort of man who preferred to wait for circumstances to arrange things in his favor, and Hank Sutton's financial difficulties had seemed, until recently, like exactly the sort of circumstances he was waiting for. He came to the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning, when the store was quiet and Rose was alone. "Miss Sutton," he said, settling himself against the counter with the ease of a man in his own house, "I hear congratulations are in order." Rose continued, organizing the shelf behind her. "Is that so?" "You and Louis Brenner," Cole said. "Quite an arrangement." The word arrangement had a specific color in his mouth, something slightly rotted. "I wanted to make sure you understood that there were other options available to you. A woman in your position, your father's debts being what they are, might benefit from knowing all her prospects." Rose turned around slowly. "My father's debts are being settled," she said. "My prospects are my own business, Mr. Cole." "Now, Rose." "Miss Sutton," she said quietly. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Miss Sutton, then, I'm simply saying that Brenner is a small operation. My ranch could offer you considerably more comfort and security." "Mr. Cole," Rose said, and her voice had that particular clarity of a woman who is being very precise on purpose. "I have heard your offer. I am declining it. If you have something to purchase in this store, I am happy to assist you. Otherwise, I would appreciate you leaving, as I have work to do." He looked at her for a moment, and she held his gaze without flinching, and he left. But something in the way he left, not embarrassed, not deflated, but recalculating, made her uneasy in a way she could not entirely name. She told Louis about it that evening. She had not intended to. It felt like something she ought to be able to handle herself, and she could, and she had. But she found she wanted to tell him, not because she needed him to do anything about it, but because she had, over the past 2 weeks, become accustomed to the particular relief of a person she could actually talk to. Louis listened to the whole account without interrupting, When she was done, he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I just thought you should know he's the kind of man who doesn't take no for an answer the first time." "He's the kind of man who doesn't take no at all," Louis said. "That's why I was worried about him in the first place." He paused. "Rose, I need to ask you something." She looked at him. "Is this, what we're doing, is it something you actually want? Because if you're going along with it because you feel you have no other choice, then I need to know that, even if it means the arrangement ends. I don't want you doing this because Cole is the alternative. That's not a reason." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the fading light. The evening smelled of sage and warm earth and the distant, sweet scent of the horse pasture. "2 weeks ago," she said slowly, "I might have said that you were the better option and left it at that. But that is not what I would say now." "What would you say now?" She met his eyes. "I would say that I come here in the evenings because I want to be here. I would say that I think about our conversations when I am not having them. I would say that I am not entirely sure what that means yet, but that it does not feel like settling and it does not feel like circumstance." She paused. "Does that answer your question?" "Yes," he said. Something in his face had softened in a way she had not seen before. "It does." They sat in the quiet of the evening together, and it was the first time Rose thought that the silence between them was not just comfortable but warm, the way silence is between people who have begun to belong to each other. 3 days before the posting of intentions was to become a formal matter at the county seat, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. Hank Sutton, in a moment of either guilt or self-interest or some muddy combination of both, went to Garrett Cole. Rose only learned of it afterward from Chester, who had learned it from Paco, who had overheard a conversation at the Silver Moon that was not meant to be overheard. Hank Sutton had approached Cole with an alternative proposal. Cole would cancel Hank's remaining debts, which were considerable, in addition to what he owed Louis in exchange for Cole's intervention in the Brenner arrangement. Specifically, Hank had suggested that if Cole could find grounds to challenge Louis's claim on the arrangement, or simply make Louis sufficiently uncomfortable to withdraw, then Rose would be available for a more advantageous situation. When Rose learned this, she sat down at the counter of the closed store in the early morning stillness and was very quiet for a long time. Then she went to Louis. She found him in the middle of a disagreement with his own morning, which is to say he was in the stable fixing a harness that had decided to come apart at the worst possible moment, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway with an expression on his face that changed quickly when he saw hers. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a man reading a situation. She told him. He set the harness down. He was very still for a moment, and then he said, with the controlled quiet of a man who is genuinely angry but is not going to let the anger run ahead of him, he went to Cole. "Yes, to sell you a second time." The plain horror of that sentence, the way he said it without softening, made something in Rose's throat close briefly before she steadied herself. "Yes," she said. Louis looked at her carefully. "What do you want to do?" She had been thinking about this on the walk over in the sharp morning air with the mountains pale against the dawn sky. "I want to finish what we started," she said. "I want to go to the county seat. I want to post the intentions." She paused. "But I want it to be a choice, mine and yours, made clear and publicly so that there is no room for my father or Garrett Cole or anyone else to rewrite it." Louis was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "I want that too," he said. "Not for convenience, not because of the debt or Cole or any of it." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing something, picking his words with care. "I want it because in 3 weeks you have become the most honest and interesting and steady person I have had a conversation with in longer than I can clearly remember. And the thought of not having that, of you not being here, is not something I am comfortable with." Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Well, that is a better reason than a card game." "Considerably," he agreed. She almost smiled. It was the first time she had almost smiled in 3 days. Louis went to speak with Hank Sutton, and this is a conversation that Rose was not present for but whose results she observed. Her father came to the store the following morning with the expression of a man who has been spoken to clearly and has not enjoyed it but has perhaps finally understood something. He sat down across from his daughter and he said, "Rose, I have been a selfish and foolish man and I am sorry." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Eleanor, about the man her father had been, about all the years between. She thought about the particular labor of loving someone who keeps failing you, and the question of whether love and disappointment can occupy the same space indefinitely. "I know you are," she said, "but being sorry is a beginning, Papa, not an end. The difference matters." He nodded slowly. "Brenner told me something." "What did he tell you?" "He told me that if I ever treated you as a commodity again, in any form, the debt he holds would become a legal matter rather than a private one." He paused. "He also told me that he intended to take care of you, and that he was asking me to let him." Rose felt something complicated move through her at that, not quite forgiveness, not quite grace, but the early edge of both. "Are you going to let him?" she asked. Her father looked at her, and for just a moment he looked like the man he had been before the years wore him down. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." As for Garrett Cole, Louis had also spoken to Cole, and this conversation had been more direct in the kind of way that two men in the frontier West understood directness. Louis had not threatened Cole. He had simply informed him, with quiet and complete seriousness, that any further interference with Rose Sutton's decisions or Louis's legal arrangement would result in Louis bringing the full record of Cole's land dealings, which Louis had made a point of learning about, and which were not entirely above question, to the attention of the county land office. Cole was a man who operated in the spaces between legality and convenience, and he knew, when looking at Louis Brenner's composed and unbothered expression, that he was dealing with someone who had done his research and was prepared to use it. Cole withdrew. Not gracefully. He was not a graceful man, but effectively. The morning that Rose and Louis rode together to the county seat at Colfax to post their intentions, the sky was a deep, washed blue with a clarity that only comes after rain, and the road was lined with chamisa beginning to show its yellow. Rose was wearing her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and Louis had put on a clean shirt and his better hat, and they rode side by side on their horses in the kind of silence that was no longer a careful holding of distance but something that belonged to them. "Are you afraid?" Louis asked at some point along the road. "No," she said. Then, honestly, a little. "Are you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. She looked at him. "Of what?" "Of not being what you deserve," he said simply. "Of getting this wrong." Rose looked at him riding beside her, this careful, honest man who had come to her store and told her the truth when he did not have to, who had sat on his porch and listened to her talk about her mother, who had gone to her father and to Cole on her behalf without making it about his own pride, who was afraid of failing her. "Louis," she said. He looked at her. "I think you are going to get some things wrong," she said. "I expect I will get some things wrong too, but I do not think honesty is something you get wrong, and I think everything else can be worked out." Something in his expression changed, deepened. He nodded once, and they rode on through the bright morning toward Colfax. The posting of intentions was a simple, practical thing, a form signed, a date established, a fee paid at the county clerk's window by a man who clearly found the romantic dimension of his job unremarkable. It was done in 15 minutes. But when they walked back out into the Colfax sunshine and stood for a moment on the steps of the courthouse with the mountains sharp against the sky and the road stretching back toward Cimarron, Rose felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with some surprise, as rightness. Louis looked at her. "Shall we go home?" "Home." She turned the word over quietly. "Yes," she said. "Let's." The wedding was held on a Friday in June at the small church on the east side of Cimarron, a modest white-painted building that the Reverend Martin kept with the same systematic attention he gave to everything, which was to say it was clean and slightly austere, but warmed considerably by the people who filled it. The people who filled it were more than Rose had expected. Cimarron was a small town with a long memory, and while the story of the gambling debt had circulated in the way stories do, changing slightly with each telling, acquiring detail it did not have and losing accuracy it should have kept, what had also circulated, in the quieter and more significant current of a town that watched its people, was the story of how Louis Brenner had gone to Rose Sutton and told her himself, and how she had met the whole terrible situation with her head up and her eyes open, and made something decent out of what had been begun indecently. The town had opinions about both Hank Sutton and Garrett Cole, and those opinions were not flattering, and they were not wrong. But the wedding itself was not about any of that. It was about a man and a woman standing together in front of a community that had watched them, over the past month, choose each other deliberately and in full knowledge of what they were choosing. Rose walked down the aisle on her own, which was a decision she had made quietly and without drama. Her father sat in the front pew looking older than she remembered him being, and she passed him with a glance that contained both love and grief and the complicated, continuing work of both. And then she looked up at Louis. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, unguarded, fully open, as though he had stopped managing how he appeared and simply was. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he knows is more than he expected, more than he planned for, more than the careful life he had built and tended could quite contain. Rose reached him and stood before him, and when Reverend Martin asked them the questions that weddings require, Louis answered his in a voice that was quiet but absolutely certain, and Rose answered hers in a voice that was the same. The ring he put on her finger was a simple gold band, smooth and plain, and when it was on she looked at it for just a moment before she looked back up at him, and he was looking at her too, and something passed between them in that moment that required no words and took no more time than a breath. When Reverend Martin declared them married, Louis took her hand not to be directed, but held, and they turned together to face the small, warm congregation, and Paco Reyes in the back row let out a sound of enthusiasm that was probably louder than was entirely appropriate for a church. And Chester tried and failed to look as though he was not quietly moved, and old Mrs. Carraway cried, as old Mrs. Carraway did at all events of consequence. The reception was held in the open air outside the church, with tables brought from the saloon and food that half the town had contributed, because Cimarron in 1878 was still a place where community was a practical and necessary thing. There was a fiddle player named Amos who played everything from hymns to reels with equal cheerfulness, and there was a barrel of cold water and a barrel of something that was not water, and the evening was warm, and the stars were beginning to come out over the mountains with their usual indifference to human occasion. Louis and Rose danced once, because Amos played a slow waltz and it would have been rude not to, and Rose, who had not expected to enjoy it, found that Louis danced with the same careful attention he brought to everything, not showy, not stiff, just present and thoughtful. His hand on her waist was warm, and she was aware of him with a clarity that was different from the intellectual interest she had felt over the past weeks, something more immediately physical and less comfortable to name, but not uncomfortable exactly. "You dance well," she told him. "My mother's contribution to my education," he said. She felt it was the one social grace that couldn't be argued against. She was right, Rose said. Then, because the evening and the music and the stars made her less careful than usual, "I am glad you came to the store and told me yourself." He looked at her as they moved through the slow turn of the waltz. "I couldn't have done anything else. Many men would have." "I know," he said. "I didn't want to be those men." She looked at him. This face she was learning, the broken nose and the amber eyes and the set of a jaw that was resolute but not hard. And she thought, with the particular clarity of a moment that feels important, that she was going to fall in love with him. She was not yet, not fully, not the complete and consuming thing that love becomes when it has had time and experience and the full weight of a life to grow in. but she was at the beginning of it, and she recognized it, and she did not look away from it. They went home to the Brenner ranch that night under a sky so thick with stars that the darkness between them barely registered. Rose had moved her things out in advance: her clothes, her mother's small box of letters, her books, the ledger she had maintained for the dry goods store until she and her father had arranged for Mrs. Kellerman's eldest son to take over the accounting. The ranch house was not large, but it was solid and well kept, with a kitchen that had good light in the mornings and a porch that faced west toward the mountains. She stood in the doorway of the house that was now her house too, and she looked at it in the lamplight, and Louis stood a step behind her and did not rush her. "It needs curtains," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I never got around to it." "I'll see to it," she said, and stepped inside. The first months of their marriage had the particular quality of two people who have agreed to a thing, and are now in the gradual process of understanding what they agreed to, which is different from the thing they agreed to in the way that living somewhere is different from visiting. They discovered each other in the small, unguarded details of daily life. The way Louis woke before dawn without difficulty, and Rose needed 20 minutes before she could string a sentence together. The way Rose kept accounts with a precision that was almost architectural, and Louis had an intuitive grasp of cattle and land that she found remarkable and occasionally maddening. The way he listened to music with his eyes closed, and she read in a focused silence that he quickly learned to respect absolutely. They argued occasionally over practical things: a decision about expanding the cattle herd, a question about whether to bring in a second hand for the summer work, the matter of the roof over the eastern end of the barn which needed attention, and whose attention was a question they disagreed about temporally if not eventually. The arguments were short and direct, and what Rose found each time was that Louis did not argue to win. He argued to figure out what was right, and when he was wrong he said so without making a drama of it, and when he was right she said so without difficulty, because she was not in the habit of pretending to convictions she did not have. By autumn she had curtains on the windows and a kitchen garden that had produced more tomatoes than any two people could reasonably process, and a certainty, growing steadily in her, that what she had built in this house with this man was something she trusted. One evening in October, the sky the color of amber above the mountains and the air beginning to carry the edge of what winter would become, Louis came in from checking the fence line on the east pasture and found Rose at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the expression of someone who has been sitting quietly with something large. He sat down across from her. He waited, because he had learned to wait. "I think I may be expecting," she said. The silence that followed was very warm. Louis looked at her across the table, and what moved across his face was something that did not go through the careful management he usually gave his expressions. It was immediate and unguarded and entirely itself, a kind of wondering gladness that she had not seen from him before but recognized instinctively as true. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but enough to say it out loud." He reached across the table and took her hand, and held it between both of his in a way that was careful and thorough, as though making certain it was real. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "Little frightened. A lot of other things." She looked at him. "You?" "The same," he said honestly. "A little frightened. A lot of other things." He paused. "Mostly the other things." She turned her hand in his so that their fingers were linked. "Good," she said. The winter came down from the mountains with its customary decisiveness, and with it came the particular intimacy of two people who are not going far from each other, who share a fire and a bed and the long, unstructured hours that cold and dark provide. Rose discovered that she loved winter evenings, which she had not known about herself before, because winter evenings on the Brenner ranch had a quality she had not previously experienced: quiet and lit and warm. Louis reading or working on some piece of equipment that needed attention, and she with her books or her letters or the household accounts, and the snow making the world outside both inhospitable and irrelevant. She also discovered, as the winter deepened, that she was unambiguously, completely, and irreversibly in love with her husband. She did not announce this to herself with any particular ceremony. It arrived the way certain things arrive when you have not been watching the horizon for them, gradually, and then all at once. She noticed one morning that the sound of him moving around in the kitchen before she woke was something she had come to need the way she needed the sound of the wind, and the smell of sage, and the weight of good book in her hands. She noticed that when something made her laugh or made her think or made her uncertain, the first thing she wanted was to tell him about it. She noticed that she had stopped thinking of the ranch as Louis's ranch and started thinking of it as theirs with an ease that surprised her. She had not told him yet. She was waiting for the right moment, which she understood was a somewhat ridiculous standard, because there was never a perfect moment for important truths any more than there had been a perfect moment for the uncomfortable ones. But she was looking for something. She found it in February, on a night when a late storm had come in fast, and Louis had been out for 2 hours helping Paco get the cattle into the lower pasture before the worst of it hit. He came in covered in snow and cold to the bone, and Rose had the kettle on before he was fully through the door, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and she brought him the tea and sat across from him while the storm made its opinions known against the windows, and he looked at her in that way he had fully, as though she were the most interesting thing in the room, which she understood by now he genuinely found her to be, and she said, without planning it, "I love you." He was quiet for just a moment. The storm pushed at the windows. The fire in the stove moved in its grate. "I know," he said, and then, immediately, "I've loved you since January, at least, possibly before." She raised an eyebrow. "Since January? The night you told me about the book I ordered," he said. "That I had ordered it before you mentioned it. You said so you were paying attention to me before all of this, and the way you said it," he stopped. "It was the way you said it, like it mattered, like you were surprised to find that you were glad." She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, with the winter at the windows and the warmth between them, and she felt the full weight and length of everything that had happened since that morning in her father's store when he had walked in with his hat in his hand and the truth in his expression. And she thought about cards and debts and fathers who fail their daughters and men who come and tell you the hard thing themselves, and the particular way that the worst circumstances can carry, sometimes, without anyone exactly planning it, the beginning of the best things. "I was glad," she said. "I know," he said again, more quietly, and reached across the table for her hand. Their son was born in May of 1879, on a morning when the chamisa outside the window was gold, and the sky was the particular blue of late spring high desert. He arrived with considerable decisiveness, and was immediately the loudest person on the Brenner ranch by a significant margin. Louis was present for the whole of it, which was not the common practice, and which the midwife, a practical woman named Mrs. Dolores Vega, regarded with the resigned tolerance of a person who has learned that some men will not be moved from where they believe they should be. When Mrs. Vega put the baby in Louis's arms and he looked down at his son with an expression Rose had never seen on any human face before, she decided it was possibly the finest thing she had ever witnessed. "What are we calling him?" she asked. She was tired in the absolute, complete way of a woman who has done the largest work of her body, but she was also more awake in some essential way than she had been in years. Louis looked up at her. "What would you like? I asked you first." He looked at the baby again, at this small, furious, remarkable person who had his mother's coloring, and a scowl that Louis privately found deeply familiar. "Thomas," he said. "For no particular reason other than it seems right." Rose considered it. "Thomas Brenner," she said. "Yes, that's right." Thomas Brenner was right in a number of ways that became evident over the following months, not least in the way he categorically refused to be unnoticed or unconsidered, which both his parents found exhausting and secretly admired. The summer that followed Thomas's birth was the fullest and most complicated season Rose could remember, and also, in a way she could not have entirely predicted, the happiest. There was a great deal of work, more work than before, and divided differently, with Thomas requiring a constant adjustment of who was available for what at any given moment. Louis was easy and natural with the baby in a way that some men were not, and Rose watched him walk Thomas at 3 in the morning through the kitchen without complaint, this rancher who was up before dawn most days, and felt the love she carried for him deepen in a way that had nothing to do with the dramatic and everything to do with the real. The dry goods store, under Mrs. Kellerman's son's accounting, had developed some trouble that Rose ended up sorting out at her father's request. She rode into town twice a week through the summer to work on the books, and she found she enjoyed it, not the work of retail itself, but the precision of accounts, the way numbers told a story that did not lie. Louis suggested, in a casual way that she recognized as deliberately understated, that there might be some use for that skill in running a small cattle operation that was in the process of expanding. She took over the Brenner Ranch accounts in September, reorganizing them with a thoroughness that made Louis examine the result with something between admiration and slight embarrassment at what had clearly been a somewhat casual previous system. "This is excellent," he said, looking at the ledger she had restructured. "The previous system was creative," she said. "I have never been accused of being organized." "You are organized about cattle." "Yes. Different skill," she said. "I'll manage the accounts. You manage the cattle. We'll do well." They did do well. The Brenner Ranch over the following year expanded by a third. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but deliberately, and with the particular effectiveness of two people whose skills were complementary rather than duplicated. Louis's instinct for livestock and land and his straightforward honesty in dealings, combined with Rose's meticulous accounts and her particular talent for reading people's actual motivations, which had been honed over years of running a retail store in a small town, made them effective partners in a way neither had entirely anticipated going in. Hank Sutton came to the ranch for Sunday dinner occasionally through this period, and these visits had the careful quality of a relationship in repair, not fully mended, not certain of itself, but continuing with a kind of determined, incremental honesty. Hank had cut back his gambling significantly, partly because Louis had helped him restructure his remaining debts in a way that gave him a clear path to clearing them, and partly because something in the consequence of what he had done to Rose had finally penetrated to whatever place in him was still capable of being reached. He was gentler with Thomas than he had perhaps been with Rose when she was small, which she noticed and chose to receive as something rather than nothing. "You're a good man, Louis Brenner," Hank said one Sunday evening, sitting on the porch with a coffee while the low sun turned the dust of the yard amber. "I'm a trying man," Louis said, "which is different." "Most men don't try," Hank said. "Not in the way you mean." Louis glanced at Rose, who was inside with Thomas, who had decided that dinner required a full theatrical performance of some kind. He said, "I have good reason to try." Hank nodded slowly. He looked at the mountains for a long moment. "She is like her mother," he said, "more than she knows." "I think she knows," Louis said quietly. "I think that's part of the reason she is." Garrett Cole left Cimarron in the winter of 1879, which was a development that was discussed at length in the Silver Moon, and less at length in more respectable establishments, and whose reasons were officially listed as a business opportunity in Texas, but were understood by those who paid attention to involve the land office inquiry that had been, in a formal but persistent way, making his continued comfortable residence in the area something of an inconvenience. Nobody was entirely sorry to see him go. Rose, when she heard, allowed herself a brief private satisfaction and then returned to the accounts she had been working on. The second winter of their marriage was the warmest in the sense that matters most, which is to say that by now they knew each other fully enough that the love between them had that quality of deep familiarity. The kind of love that is not diminished by the ordinary but sustained and deepened by it, that does not require the extraordinary to maintain itself, because it is woven into the texture of regular days. Rose knew that Louis would bring her a second cup of coffee in the morning, without being asked, because he always knew when she needed it. Louis knew that Rose's left eyebrow slightly raised expression meant she was more uncertain than she was admitting, and that the right response was to ask a direct question rather than leave it for later. They had the small, particular language of two people who have been paying close attention to each other, and it was, Rose thought privately, one of the greatest things she had not known to want. The evening that served as the hinge of everything, the moment that retrospectively made all of it fully real and fully closed, happened in the second winter, when Thomas was about 8 months old and the ranch was settled and the work was distributed and the mountains were deep in snow and the ranch house was warm with firelight. Louis was sitting at the kitchen table working on an order for spring cattle when Rose came in from putting Thomas down, and she sat across from him and looked at him for a moment, and he looked up. "What?" he asked. "I've been thinking about the beginning," she said. He put down his pen. When she said things like that, they required his full attention. "Which part of the beginning?" he asked. "The morning you came into the store," she said. "The very first morning when you told me." He waited. "I've been thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't," she said. "If you had just let it stand, let me find out some other way, or from my father, or not at all until it was already done. I thought about not telling you," he said, "for about an hour the night before." "I know," she said, "but you did." "I couldn't have not," he said. "That's the thing," she said. "I know that now. But I didn't know that then, and you were a stranger, and you came and told me the truth about a terrible thing rather than let me be ignorant of my own situation, and I have been thinking about what that cost you." He looked at her steadily. "It didn't cost me anything I regret." "I know," she said again. "That's the point." She paused. "I fell in love with you in pieces, Louis. Each piece was something I had noticed about you. The first piece was that morning and you coming to tell me yourself, and the way you looked like you knew it was the right thing even though it was the hard thing." Louis was quiet for a moment. The fire moved in the grate. "I was terrified," he said. "I thought you would throw something." "I considered it," she said. "What stopped you?" "You told me the truth," she said simply. "It is very difficult to throw something at a man who is telling you the truth." He looked at her, and the amber of his eyes in the firelight was warm and deep and fully present in the way he was always fully present, and he said, "Rose, that morning in the store, you were the most remarkable person I had encountered in a very long time. The way you stood there, the way you didn't fall apart, the way you asked me what I wanted. I thought then that if I was very fortunate and very careful, and did not get in the way of my own chances." "You didn't," she said. "No," he said. "I don't think I did." She reached across the table and took his hand the way he had taken hers across that same table when she told him about Thomas, with the same thorough care, and they sat together in the firelight with the snow at the windows and the baby sleeping down the hall, and it was everything. Spring came again to Cimarron, as it always did, with chamisa and wildflowers and the particular energy of a world that has been closed down for winter, and is opening again with considerable enthusiasm. Thomas Brenner, now walking with the specific determination of a 12-month-old who has discovered the full possibility of movement, provided his parents with a constant and mobile reminder that the world contained more of interest than could be apprehended from a stationary position. The ranch was doing well, better than well, by the standards of the territory. Louis had established a reputation for the quality of his cattle and the straightforwardness of his dealings, which in Cimarron was the kind of reputation that compounded with time, and Rose had begun helping 2 other small ranching families in the area with their accounts, a project she had taken on because they asked, and because she found the work satisfying in a way that had to do with order and purpose, and her particular feeling that things should function properly, and she was capable of making that happen. On the occasion of their first anniversary, Louis came in from the morning work and set a package on the kitchen table. Rose looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it," he said. The package contained a book she had been wanting for 2 years and had never been able to find in the territory, a collection of scientific essays that she had mentioned once, exactly once, in a conversation 8 months ago. She looked at him. "You remembered." "I wrote it down," he said. "The night you mentioned it. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget." She looked at the book and then at him, and what she felt was the full, particular, irreplaceable warmth of being known. Being actually, specifically known. Not as a general person or a pleasant woman or a useful partner, but as Rose, whose preferences and words were worth remembering and worth the effort of acting on. "Thank you," she said. She kissed him, which was intended to be brief and became less brief, which pleased both of them. The second anniversary was quieter. They were in the middle of a busy season and the observance was simple. A good dinner and an evening on the porch with the mountains going purple in the dusk, Thomas asleep inside. Their hands linked on the armrest of the swing Louis had put up at Rose's suggestion in the late spring. "Are you happy?" Louis asked. It was such a direct question, coming from him, that it stopped her for just a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was counting the weight of it, giving it the consideration it deserved. "I am," she said, "genuinely, specifically, unreservedly happy." She paused, which I did not expect. "No," he looked at her. "I expected something functional," she said. "When we agreed to go forward, I expected something that worked. I did not expect this." She gestured slightly, meaning the evening, the mountains, him, herself, all of it. "What is this?" he asked, not because he didn't know, but because he liked hearing her name things. "This is a life I would have chosen," she said, "if I had been given all the choices in the world and known what to choose." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then he said, "Same." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together as the stars came out, one after another, above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, above the dry goods store and the Silver Moon Saloon and the white church and the small courthouse, and all the roads that led toward and away from this place, this life, this particular ordinary, extraordinary evening. Thomas had a sister in the autumn of 1881, arriving with rather less drama than her brother, but with a focus that was immediately apparent, fixing her dark eyes on the world with the expression of someone taking careful inventory. They named her Elinor, for Rose's mother, which Rose proposed and Louis accepted with a seriousness that made clear he understood what the name carried. Louis Brenner was, from the beginning, a person of considerable interior life, in contrast to her brother, who was a person of considerable exterior life, and their combination made the ranch house a place of constant and varied noise and interest that both Louis and Rose found sometimes overwhelming and always irreplaceable. Hank Sutton, as Thomas and Elinor grew, became the grandfather he had perhaps always been meant to be, more patient with grandchildren than he had managed to be with his own child, more present, more careful. The debts were cleared by 1882. The gambling never fully disappeared, but it reduced itself to something manageable and occasional and no longer ruinous, and Rose chose to accept this as the best her father could do and to love him within those limits. She had learned, in the years since the card game, that people contain contradictions, and that the work of love is partly the work of deciding which contradictions you can live alongside. This did not mean accepting harm. It meant the particular wisdom of knowing the difference between what someone is and what you wish they were, and choosing clearly between the two. Her father was a man who had done a terrible thing from weakness and had spent years afterward trying, imperfectly and inconsistently but genuinely, to do better. That was what he was. She loved him as that, not as the man she wished he had been. Paco Reyes, who had worked for Louis since before Rose arrived at the ranch, married a woman named Catalina in 1883 and brought her to the Brenner property with the slightly anxious air of a young man hoping his employer will think well of his choices. Rose made Catalina welcome with the directness and warmth that was her particular way of making people feel seen, and the two women were fast friends within a fortnight, which pleased Paco enormously and pleased Rose because Catalina was funny and practical, and had opinions she was not shy about sharing, which Rose found entirely refreshing. Chester, the older hand, had a bad winter in 1882 with his hip, and retired the following spring to a small house at the edge of the Brenner land that Louis had built for him without making it a subject of discussion, which was the manner in which he did most acts of generosity, quietly, as a fact rather than a gesture. Chester spent his days after that whittling things for Thomas and a leaner that were of variable quality but invariable enthusiasm, and Thomas kept every single one of them in a line on his windowsill, which Chester pretended not to know about but which pleased him more than he would say. By 1884, the Brenner Ranch was a going concern by any measure that mattered, not wealthy, not sprawling, but solid and real, built on honest dealing and careful work, and the particular synergy of two people who happen to be suited to each other in the ways that count. Rose had by now a reputation in the county for her accounting and business sense that extended beyond the ranching families, and had brought her one small commission from the county itself, a fact that she considered not without irony, given that it was in the county courthouse that she and Louis had posted their intentions 6 years earlier. She was sitting on the porch one evening in the late summer of 1884, with a leaner in her lap working through a picture book, and Thomas visible in the yard conducting some incomprehensible but clearly important business with a stick and 3 rocks, and Louis came out from the barn and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps looking at his family with the expression she had come to know as his private expression. The one he wore when he thought no one was watching, open and quiet and full of something that required no name because it was its own sufficient and complete thing. She caught his eye. He came up the steps and sat beside her in the swing, and a leaner immediately required rearrangement to accommodate this development, which she managed with the efficiency of a 3-year-old who has never found adults particularly convenient and has adapted accordingly. "How was the fence?" Rose asked. "Fixed," he said. He looked at a leaner with the book. "What are we reading?" "A cat," a leaner said, pointing. "And another cat." "2 cats," Louis agreed seriously. "2," Eleanor confirmed with the satisfaction of counting. Thomas appeared at the bottom of the steps. "Papa, I need your help with something." "In a moment," Louis said. "It's urgent," Thomas said. "In a moment," Louis said again, with the mild implacability of a man who has had 6 years of practice. Thomas weighed this, decided it was final, and returned to the rocks, which apparently could sustain their urgency briefly. Rose watched all of this, her son with his projects, her daughter with her cats, her husband with his quiet presence, and she thought about a morning in a store with flour on her hands, and a man with his hat in his hand and the truth in his expression, and everything that had grown from that beginning, all the strange and improbable and real life of it. "Louis," she said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her sideways with that particular readiness, the way he always received what she said fully without bracing. She smiled and let it tell him what words would take longer. His expression shifted. She watched it happen, the recognition, the gladness, that unguarded warmth that was entirely his own. "Again," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Again," she confirmed. He took her hand. Eleanor looked between them with the philosophical interest of a 3-year-old, then returned to her cats. Thomas's urgent business with the rocks continued unabated. The mountains were turning gold in the long evening light, and the air smelled of sage and warm earth and the approach of autumn, and the ranch was quiet in the way that a full life is quiet, not empty, but at rest between its moments, holding everything it contained with the ease of something that has grown strong enough for its own weight. Rose Sutton, Rose Brenner. For 6 years now, though she had kept both names in her mind the way she kept both parts of herself, looked at the mountains and felt the particular completeness of a woman who has arrived somewhere real. Not somewhere perfect, somewhere real, which is better. A place built from honest beginning and daily choosing, and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply becomes the texture of your days. inseparable from morning and work, and the sound of boots on floorboards and the warmth of a hand in the lamplight. She thought again, as she did occasionally, about the flour on her hands and the hymn she had been singing, and the moment before everything changed, the last moment of the life she had expected, the last moment before Louis Brenner walked into the store and told her the truth and changed everything. She was glad. She was fully, specifically, irreversibly glad. "Thomas," Louis called from the porch. "Come show me what you have." Thomas came at a run. Alina turned a page. The mountains held the light, and Rose Brenner leaned her head against her husband's shoulder on the porch of the home they had built together out of a beginning that should not have worked and had worked because they had been honest with each other from the first possible moment, because honesty turned out to be, as it usually does when people actually practice it, the best possible foundation for the best possible things. The third child, another son, they would name him James, would arrive in the spring, and with him would come the particular chaos and wonder of 3 children in a ranch house built for 2. And Louis would add a room to the house himself over the summer with Paco's help and considerable good-natured argument about the best way to frame a doorway. And Rose would paint the new room's walls herself, while the children watched with the intense critical interest of small people, observing adult activities that seem both important and slightly mysterious. Chester would make a rocking horse of slightly uncertain proportions for the baby, and Thomas and Alina would argue over whose turn it was to try it before James was old enough, which was a dispute that outlasted the summer. Hank Sutton would be at the table for Sunday dinner the first time James laughed, and the sound of his own grandfather's laughter rising in response would be one of the clearest sounds in Rose's memory for the rest of her life. The sound of a man who had done harm and who was, in this moment at least, simply glad, simply present, simply himself in the best way he could manage it. It was enough. Most things, when they are real, are enough. The Silver Moon Saloon would burn down in 1886 and be rebuilt by 1887, which was Cimarron's way. Things came apart and came back together, and the town persisted with the stubbornness of a place that has decided to exist and has not yet been given sufficient reason to reconsider. The Brenner Ranch would persist with the same stubbornness, better tended and more deliberate, growing slowly in the way of things that are built to last rather than to impress. And on a particular evening many years on from a card game in the Silver Moon, when the children were older, and the mountains were the same, and the sage still sweetened the air at dusk, Louis Brenner would find his wife on the porch in the last light of a long day, and he would sit beside her, and they would not say anything for a long time, because they had said everything there was to say and would go on saying it, and the silence between them was the silence of a life built well, of 2 people who had chosen each other carefully and kept choosing every day since, and who had found in that choosing something large enough to hold everything they were, and everything they had made, and everything they still intended to do, which is not a small thing, which is, in fact, the whole of it.